The manipulation of evidence continues, and our hopes of impartiality are destroyed. It is evident that everything has been done to make Colin's case disappear. There is without doubt no impartiality. At this stage, the Fiscal's only insight into this case is through the situation reports we've seen earlier and the area fiscal. Very little information had been shared with our family. Although we had heard enough to be concerned, so we joined scientific research groups. This allowed us to research knife fatalities. It was from here we found a research paper by Professor Mike Green, so we reached out to him on 9th of February 2009.
February 2009, I think. I remember it well. The reason he had got hold of me, he'd been doing an internet search on stabbing, and he had found a paper written by me in the mid-1970s on some experiments I had done. After discussing the case, I said I would try and help him. Even at that stage, though I knew very little about it, expressed my doubts that this was a suicide. I think the thing that really hit me between the eyes right from the outset was that this was a stab wound through the sternum. And I knew that whatever type of knife had been used and whoever had been doing it would have taken a considerable degree of force to transfix the sternum and get into the underlying heart.
Professor Green not only had an opinion on this, he carried out research to justify his thoughts. We passed this information on to Ullerenny MP.
When I got involved in this case, I decided I'd better do a little bit of practical work on this, and with the coroner's permission, when I did autopsies and I'd removed the breastbone, I attempted to stab them using various types of knife. I did about a dozen altogether, and I found it very, very difficult to get through the sternum. I could penetrate one table, but not get it transfixing the bone.
The influence of Professor Green helped persuade Ullerenny to ask the Lord Advocate for Professor Busuttil's opinion to be included in the investigation. We are now far more aware of the significance of Colin's wound, but must remember what Fife Police are saying in the background. We have already seen that according to the Fife Police, the frequency of Colin's drug use has went from occasional to regular, without any evidence to support this change. So before we consider what was said to the family at this meeting on the 20th of February, by increasing the rhetoric on his drug taking, they bring into play the idea he could have been psychotic. This emphasis on abusing drugs can be an argument in itself for someone taking their own life. An important aspect from the meetings we will discuss is that they are only proof by fiscal and police. At the outset of this meeting, the family raised concerns that they believed that the Fife Police only had to give summary reports to the fiscal for them to make an assessment. It stated that they would consider all full statements, documents and information on their home system to make an assessment. But we know from what we've seen already, in Colin's case, this is blatantly untrue. When this officer goes on to explain his findings on Colin's drug taking, we find that in a matter of 4 days, we've now gone from regular use of cocaine to abusing cocaine, and how interesting that the language now fits the report that they were circulating with the Fiscal's office. Also, as a matter of record, there was no new statements taken by Fife Police in the intervening days. This nailing of Colin's death to a definite suicide is compounded when the CSI also talks about the fact they had established that Colin had stated that his life wouldn't be worth living if he lost Candace. They also used comments from neighbours and work to suggest that he was severely down at this time. The Chief Superintendent again pushed the idea that the wound was to the side of Colin's sternum. He was not forthcoming with any details when pushed. We also find that these comments are missing from the meeting minutes. Also, when asked about a third person being at the house, we are told that they have talked to Candace's father and aunts, and they said that no one else went to the house. In fact, an aunt and uncle refused to talk to the police, and their father wasn't interviewed until the following year. The uncle who refused to talk was actually the first family member at the scene. Because of the collective insight we had already gained through the inputs of many people who had spoken to the police, we were really finding this unbelievable. We are also very aware that the inputs of Colin's mum and Candace's call to Chris are again being ignored by the police. So what we took away from this, and was eventually proven, was that this was all lies, misdirection, and exaggeration of fact. There were two positives that came from this meeting. The crowd told us they were going to get an opinion from Professor Busuttil, which is something we greatly desired. Also, the Chief Superintendent was ordered to look into the demeanour of Candace Bonnar and report back at the next meeting. In the aftermath of the meeting at the Fiscal's office, both Colin's father and Colin's mother independently wrote back to the Fiscal, raising concerns about the representation of Colin by Fife Police, and also concerns about the minutes of the meeting. We see that Colin's father was disbelieving, and needed to know what quantity and frequency Colin was taking drugs. Surely this would have been the most basic piece of information that the Fiscal should have demanded from the police. The letter from Colin's mum highlights not only missing information, but the belief that Fife Police were misleading us, and they want us to believe that Colin had killed himself. Through this year, and in the course of these meetings, invariably the minutes are late and incomplete. On March 9, 2009, Willie Rennie received a letter from the Solicitor General. He reaffirmed what we had been told at our meeting with the Fiscal, that Professor Busuttil would be asked for an opinion. There is no underplaying the significance of this action. For the first time, we have an input coming from someone outside those that have controlled the investigation from day one. The second meeting begins with a clearly obvious change of tone from the Chief Superintendent. Professor Busuttil is clearly having an impact. The Fiscal informs us that there has been verbal feedback from Professor Busuttil. He states that Colin's death is unlikely to be caused by suicide. He says an act like this would be like 1 in 10,000 for suicide. We're also informed that the professor at Dundee Pathology Lab said that pathology alone can't determine the perpetrator, but needs a thorough police investigation. The varied inputs from Dundee Pathology will continue to be a problem for this case. We were also informed that Professor Busuttil had stated that the level of drugs in Colin's urine was so small that it must have been taken some days before his death. This is a significant shift from the Fife Police position. Unfortunately, this will not stop them corrupting the influence of drugs in this case. At the previous meeting, the Chief Superintendent was told to report back on any findings on Candace's demeanour. At that stage they said there was nothing negative to be found, and in this meeting he says no further information was available at this point, and he clearly stated that no one talked negatively about Candace and Colin's relationship. And of course this is factually nonsense. They have many statements about the relationship that are not all positive. And maybe more importantly, the detectives who were carrying out the investigation were actually writing about these issues in their own final personal statements for this investigation. So it's clear that these statements haven't been missed or just overlooked. They're actually being ignored. The Fiscal's office informed us that they now had possession of all the statements and would be going through them thoroughly. We were informed that the statements which had already been reviewed showed a fair balance in the comments about Colin and Candace's relationship. Surely with a thorough review of these statements, the disparity with the police summaries will be obvious. It was also stated that this case would never get an FAI. This is a very important point, because it would mean to those involved, including the police, the misrepresentations within the investigation would remain hidden from the public eye. Around the same time as Professor Busuttil's report was received, which stated that there was more likelihood of a homicide here, 2 senior police officers retire in Fife Police. One is the Chief Superintendent who's been attending the meetings, and the other is the immediate boss, who was a guy in charge in February 2008. This third meeting was a fairly short meeting, and it was covering actions driven by Crown Counsel. We were informed that Crown Counsel believed that this death should have been treated as a homicide from the outset, unless proven otherwise. It was also stated that Crown Counsel were leading this investigation and the Fiscal was merely supervising. Among the actions being driven by Crown Counsel was the introduction of precognition. This is the process of key witnesses being interviewed by a lawyer from the Fiscal's office. There was also going to be a psychological assessment to look at Colin and Candice, and also a toxicology review to look at the effects of drugs on Colin. Interestingly, there would be nothing like this for Candice. Clearly, the quality of these reviews will only be as good as the quality of the information provided by the police. These other 4 requests by Crown Counsel were effectively not carried out. The only one where we saw any detail was on the timeline of the calls to the ambulance, and the quality of analysis thereafter was either poor or deliberately misleading. All of these actions seem valid, and it suggests that Crown Counsel know what they want to do, but along with door-to-door investigations, which is part of a murder investigation, we see that none of these things are done. So why would that be? At the end of May 2009, Fife Police delivered their final situation report. Despite being brought up constantly by the family, and the statement being available for almost 2 years, this is the first acknowledgement of Colin's call to his mother, which was less than 20 minutes before he was stabbed. Colin had told her that he would come over to the States if this never worked out. She also talked about seeing Colin every night, and was so unconcerned about his state of mind, she was still planning to go home to California the next day. This was all verifiable, because all they had to do was check if her tickets had been cancelled. We see the introduction of Candice's relationship with another man. In itself is unimportant, but why leave out he got drugs at her house? And they still could not trace the source of the email from the fake address that was sent to Candice, nor could they find the source of the wound to Colin's forehead. They do offer that the professor at Dundee had said that possibly the bracelet in Colin's wrist or the zip in the handbag could have caused this. It was also stated that the wound could be matched to whatever caused it, yet they had these 2 artefacts and never tried to match it. They also failed to mention that the professor actually said that it may have been caused by another item that's no longer present, and there was something else present in the video. It must be remembered that these situation reports are seen as additive to the previous ones, and if there's no mention of changes, then what's went before still holds true. So we see no change to Colin's drug taking, no update on Colin's demeanour, and no update on Candice's demeanour. So they're holding firm on the misrepresentation from the earlier reports, despite this now definitely being a murder inquiry. And they still don't include the call to Colin's brother at 7 PM that night. They talk of tracing the fake email, but don't include a call Candice made about it. But all of these issues would surely be picked up by the Fiscal reading the statements and the precognition process. They must have seen these issues, and did nothing. The Fiscal knew that we were talking to Professor Mike Green and getting advice on how to deal with this case. So they asked Mike Green to give an opinion on the case as well. In this case, he concurred with Professor Busuttil, but instead of it really being added and given corroboration, they immediately said there was an issue with his methodology and he was making certain assumptions. This was later debunked at the FAI. They never sought to resolve this. They effectively hid his findings and had removed our key advisor. He could not talk about the case once he had given a professional opinion. This next Fiscal's meeting covered a lot of old ground. What we were unaware of was how far the police were going to go to stymie this investigation. Some issues did come to the fore, and they will become the focus of this story in the near future. The first point raised is actually a repeat of something that was coming from the police previously, and it's about the wound coming from the side rather than through the sternum. This is a push in line with previous Fife police comments, and lends itself to the idea that this wound was easier to self-inflict. The next comment relates to the pathologist from Dundee, and seems to place them on a higher plane than the other pathologists. How can 2 pathologists who are not asked for their opinions be the police and Fiscal's main advisors? We're also told that based upon initial psychological assessment and based upon the information they have at hand to date, there was no evidence that Colin was suicidal or that Candice was homicidal. And finally they said that they had an interview strategy for Candice if they had the opportunity to question her again. On the 6th of July 2009, Candice was arrested on suspicion of murder. But how will the police manage this? How will this be conveyed by the fiscal to Colin's family?